So the other day I'm listening to this podcast and it's talking about the Pentateuch. If you're not familiar with that term, it's just simply the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in the podcast, it reminded me of when the Pentateuch was most likely written. It was written shortly after the Israelites have left Egypt, and it's God's message to them of what He wants them to remember after they've spent the last 430 years as slaves in Egypt and as they're going to get ready to head into the Promised Land. And that reminder really just stuck with me. I could not believe I had forgotten that, because I think that kind of paints how you read through the first 5 books of the Bible. And so as I'm listening to this podcast, it points out some other really interesting things. I want to share with you something that I discovered through this podcast and through going back and rereading Genesis 1 and the following chapters. I love the book of Genesis. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. And Genesis 1 especially is so important because if you read a lot, then you know, especially if you're reading a novel, the most important pages are the first and last page. In fact, the most important sentences are the first and last sentences of a book. And I don't know if you do this, but I do. If I'm going to read a novel, a lot of times I'll flip to the end of the book, to the very last page, and read the last sentence, only the last sentence. And it won't make any sense, but I just want to have an idea of what's the second most important sentence in the book, because it's the last sentence. The most important sentence of the book is the first sentence. Well, when you open to the first sentence of the Bible, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." We have to ask ourselves, why do we have Genesis 1? What's the point of Genesis 1? Well, I think there's a number of reasons why we have Genesis 1, but there's this line that continues to be repeated throughout Genesis 1. In fact, it's going to be repeated 6 times. It says, there was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening and there was morning the second day. All throughout days 3 through 6, it will continue to say there was evening and there was morning. But then you get to day 7. See, one of the downsides to the way our Bibles are compiled is that we have chapters and verses. And they're helpful to be able to say, hey, turn to Genesis chapter 2. But one of the downsides is sometimes we can break up a chapter where it wasn't meant to be broken up. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through I think it's about 3, were meant to be read in Genesis chapter 1 with the first original creation account. And if you separate it, you're going to miss something so important, because when you get to chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, you're going to read about day 7. And what's unique about day 7 is it doesn't have that phrase, there was evening and there was morning. Is there something weird to you about that phrase, there was evening and there was morning? I don't know about you, but for me, for my entire life, my days have began with morning and then evening. But I'm reading the Bible as a Western Christian, as an American Christian, whose day begins in the morning, where I get up and I go do something, and then I end my day with rest. But that's not the case for the original audience. The original audience was Israel. And what we know about Jewish time is that their day began in the evening. At sundown, the next day began. And so their day literally began with the evening and then the morning. And so the first thing that an Israelite would have done in the day is they would have rested. They began their day not with doing something, but with resting. And that understanding sort of unlocked for me maybe a hidden meaning inside of Genesis 1. Yeah, it tells us about the creation of the world, and it's a beautiful account, but there are little gems hidden inside of Genesis chapter 1 that I believe are so powerful, and here's one of them. Days 1 through 6, you read that phrase, there was evening and there was morning. But on day 7, you don't read that day 7 actually ended. Why is that? Is it possible because God is inviting us into day 7? That day 7 is something eternal. Stick with me here for just a minute. Let's remember who this book was written to. It was originally written to the nation of Israel, who had spent the last 430 years as slaves in the land of Egypt. And what did they do for 430 years? They made bricks. That's what we learned about in the first couple chapters of the book of Exodus. They made bricks. Their entire day, their entire life, their entire identity was built upon producing bricks. And as they began to grow, as God gets ready to rescue Israel out of Egypt, some things happen that the Pharaoh, the king over Egypt, decides to make their task even harder. And so they don't provide them the straw for the bricks. And so now their task becomes even more difficult. Well, what happens as a slave if you can no longer produce? Well, now you're worthless. And you might just be removed from the situation. You don't just retire as a former slave brickmaker. You might be killed. You might be discarded. Who knows what would happen? Your entire identity for the last 400 plus years, for the last 5 plus generations, has been in making bricks. Your identity was tied to what you can produce. Well, here's Israel leaving Egypt, coming into the promised land. And their entire identity, their entire understanding of what it means to live is to produce. Am I talking to you yet? Do you live on a to-do list? Do you live with a list of things you need to get done today? I do. I wake up thinking about, what am I going to do today? Oftentimes I go to bed thinking about, what do I need to do tomorrow? Because I know for me, my identity gets tied up in what I do. What can I produce? What can I get done today? It's not built in my rest. But here is God in the very first page of the Bible, inviting Israel into rest. In day 1, day 2, day 3, all the way through day 6, he creates and he produces. But then in day 7, he rests. Why does God rest? It's not because he needed to. It's not because God was tired. It's not because God said, oh man, all of this creating, I need to go take a nap. It's because the work was finished. God had done what he had set out to do, and he said, that's it. That's enough. And God rested. And in the rhythm and life of Israel, God was going to build in a weekly rest. For them, day 7 would always be a day of rest. The laws of the Sabbath would guide them all throughout their history as God would give them their laws, as you would read about later in the book of Exodus. But here early on, in the very first page of the Bible, God is building in an identity for Israel. Your identity is not tied to what you can produce. It's not based on how many bricks you can make. As you head into the promised land, don't get so caught up in what you can do and what you can produce. Don't forget who you are. You are made in the image of God. You are created in the image of the one who rests, who knows when to say, that's it. It's finished, and I'm going to rest. And so on day 7, why doesn't it say there was evening and there was morning the 7th day? Because for God, for what he was inviting Israel into, and what I believe he's inviting you and I into, is a day of eternal rest. When you're in the presence of God, the work is finished. He said it's good and it's complete. And he's inviting you and I into an eternal rest. So today, you can be reminded your identity is not tied to what you can produce and what you can do. Your identity is built in the one who created you, who invites you into rest. And maybe that's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, do you remember verse 28? When he looks out on the crowd and he sees all these people who are weary and worn down and they're scattered like sheep without a shepherd, and he says, come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find, do you remember? You will find rest for your souls. What you need to do today, this week, is not just get so caught up in what you can produce, but to rest in who God is and who he's created you to be.